It doesn't really matter if it's Springsteen or if it's Joe Blow. You know, it's still the same. I have to deal with it the same way. Everything that I mix, I think of as being unique in some way. And so a lot of times I'll try to do something unusual or try to come up with something that's just inspired by the song or by the music. That's just basically whatever it is, and not with any preconceived notions. Records that I used to listen to, of course, the Beatles were a big thing, and I loved the way the record sounded. But Hendrix came along, and I thought something's going on there. Somebody's involved in these records beyond Jimmy, I'm sure, because there's things panning back and forth in the stereo. You know, there was all this kind of phasing and flanging and interesting effects going on, and I thought, I wonder who's doing that. And there was names on these records like Eddie Kramer and Glyn Johns, and well, who are those guys? I want to be one of those guys. I want to know what they're doing. I guess I was 18, and I had a band, and we used to play this little bar in Portchester, New York, and the lead singer was friends with a guy named Michael DeLug, who was an engineer at a studio called Media Sound in New York. And so they wrote songs together, and so he wanted to get his songs recorded. So the singer and the band talked him into letting us, basically producing some demos for us in the studio. It was the first time I'd ever walked into a recording studio, and I remember walking in and looking around and thinking, geez, I could live in this place. I want to know what this is about, because I was always the guy in the band with the tape machine. I recorded the gigs and recorded the rehearsals and stuff like that. You know, and I started learning about editing, and I got this guy Michael to show me all these, you know, what he was doing and recording. So I just kept coming around to the studio, and I made friends with the people at the studio, and I talked them into hiring me. I said, look, this is what I'm going to do with my life, and I'm going to be good at it someday. I really believe that, and you should hire me. So they said, okay, if you stop bugging me, if you'd stop bugging us, come back in September, and because some of the interns will have gone back to school, and you can start in the shipping department. All right, great. And so I came back in September, reported to the shipping department, went out on a delivery. I came back, and the receptionist, after an hour, receptionist goes, hey, are you that Clearmountain kid? Yeah, that's me. Oh, they're looking for you upstairs. You better get up there, because they've been looking. Like, oh, great. You know, like I'm in trouble already. I've been here an hour, and I've screwed up. And so I walk up, and they said, where have you been? I said, well, I went out in a delivery. Oh, well, we don't need runners. We need an assistant engineer. Okay, get down to Studio A. Okay, fine. Well, that was quick. I thought it was going to take 3 years, and it took an hour. So I walk into Studio A, and it's a Duke Ellington session, and he's overdubbing a horn section onto a piece of music that he had recorded. The funny thing was that he was yelling at his trumpet player because his trumpet player showed up drunk, and he's cursing at him. And so I'm this 19-year-old kid at the time. I didn't know famous people swore. And that was my big revelation. And so, but then it went on from there, and I fell into the whole thing really quickly. I assisted and started doing sessions pretty quick. Kool Gang was the first session I ever did. It was actually the engineer that was on the the Duke Ellington session. He got booked on the Kool Gang session. I don't think he liked working on records, actually. They did a lot, mostly jingles at that studio during the day. So he said, oh, look, why don't you do the session? Really? Okay, I've been here for, 2.5 months, something like that, and you want me to sit down and actually do the session? Yeah, you'll be fine. Well, all right. And so, I wasn't one to say no. And it was the first time I'd ever actually sat behind the desk with clients. But luckily, Kool Gang, Ron Bell, who was the leader of the band, just the nicest guy in the world. And it just didn't seem to bother him, you know. I guess because I was young and the other guy was an older guy, because it was 16 track at the time, there weren't a lot of tracks. He did a whole bunch of, it was all monophonic Moogs or something like that, and so he wanted to bounce them down, and I didn't even know what that was, bouncing tracks. Okay, let's bounce them down to another track. I go, okay, and I looked over at Joe, the engineer, who's sitting there reading the newspaper, and I go, how do I? He goes, you'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. Okay, it's like, so, you know, thinking really quickly, and so I bounced down tracks, and then we actually mixed one of the songs. But then what was interesting is they came back 6 months later to start their next album and to do basic tracks, and so I got booked on the thing as an assistant engineer. Tony Bon Jovi, who is just John Bon Jovi's cousin, he was one of the main engineers at the studio. He was booked as the engineer, but he didn't show up. And so I set the session up. The band started rehearsing. So I thought, well, he's not here, so somebody better do something. So I sat down and started getting sounds. And Tony never showed up, and Ron came in. He came back and listened back. He goes, yeah, and soloed all the instruments. He goes, that sounds fine. Okay, let's go, you know. And so we recorded two fairly big hit songs. There was a song called Hollywood Swingin' and another song called Funky Stuff. So those are the first two things I ever recorded professionally. And so that worked out pretty well for me. I was still an assistant engineer, though, for a couple of years after that. The early days, I didn't really like mixing. It just seemed like the boring part, you know. And not only that, it was difficult because there wasn't any automation yet, and you kind of had to get everything at once, and I could never really perfect a mix to my satisfaction. And Tony came to me, said, I'm building a studio, and we built Power Station. And then we got the first SSL that had an automated. Actually, we had an API console at Media, and it had some real basic automation. It was really crude automation at the time. But then when SSL came along and had some pretty serious automation, all of a sudden I can listen to the mix while I'm mixing instead of having to do the mix and then listen back later. That's when it started to get to be a really fun thing for me. And I started doing stuff for the Stones. I did the Miss You single mix for the Stones, and Roxy Music, and of course Chic they were our first big clients at Power Station. I think Le Freak was the biggest selling single that Atlantic Records had up to that point. And I was doing all the recording and mixing. I worked at Power Station it opened in '77, in the summer of '77, and I worked there till about like 82, around there, 82, 83. Then on and off after that. I went on to start producing things, because it was like what engineers were supposed to do back then. You know, you become an engineer, I guess the same thing now, and you go on to producing. And so I thought that was the thing, and I produced about 20 or 30 records, and finally realized I hated producing, and that mixing was the thing that I enjoyed the most. We built the studio. I had a guy named Brett Taney did the acoustics. I laid it out. I said, this is the room that I want. And it worked great. I mean, like I said, the first session was Streets of Philadelphia. It was a pretty big hit. And it went on from there, and we were just busy nonstop. And I ordered the SSL from, a new G series from them, custom G series, and bought all the gear. I had an AMS digital delay and a reverb, I think, and a couple other bits. And of course now we've topped it off. My last two pieces of gear I bought from you guys, I believe, were a couple of brand new Pultec EQP 1A3s. I've done a couple in the box mixes, and they came out pretty good, to be honest. I wasn't disappointed. I think You know, people say, oh, well, you can't get as good of a sound in the box as you can on a console. I don't know if that's true. I really don't know. It's just so much, I'm just so much more comfortable, and I can work a lot faster. I can hit 10 EQs on 10 channels in a matter of seconds, whereas trying to do that in the box is pretty tough. I can work much faster. I feel like it's a lot more efficient, and it's more fun. I'm just more comfortable working on an analog console. The piece of gear that I wouldn't want to do without would be Pultecs. First off, the EQP 1A3 I just think or the 1A, which is basically the same thing, are just invaluable. It's amazing. It's such an old design from the 60s, but there's something about, you put that on a guitar and it just sounds better. You know, you can brighten something and it doesn't get harsh. On drums, I always have a Pultec on the snare drum. In fact, I use the 2 Pultecs that I bought from Vintage King. They're always on the piano. The Uri compressors, the LA3A, I love. I would use 2As, but I have 4 3As here. I have a couple more 3As at the other studio, and they're just incredible for vocals because they're very transparent. That you can do quite a bit of compression without it sounding compressed. I actually prefer the 1178s for some reason. Well, first of all, that you can get 2 for the price of 1, and in fact, they're a little cheaper than a blackface 1176. I use them on stereo tom-toms all the time. I use them on snare drum and vocals. I go back and forth on the vocals depending on the song. You know, they're a bit more, you hear the compression a bit more on 1176 or an 1178. And so sometimes for some rock stuff, I really want to hear it pumping a bit. Well, mixing is great because I'm presented with something that I haven't heard before. And so I'm totally objective about it. And I push up the faders, and it's a new thing. Though there will be some projects that are overwhelming to me, that I just think, what am I going to do with this? So it's a whole process, and it's like doing a puzzle. I mean, it really is. You get something that you haven't heard before, and you figure out what all the characters are, and it's like, how do these all fit together? How does it all work? How does it become an actual song? Something that Springsteen always drilled into my head was, sure, everything should have a nice sound, but nothing should ever distract from the narrative of the song, of what the song's about, and what the character. It's not necessarily, it's the singer, of course, but it's the character that the singer's portraying. Nothing should come between the listener and that character. So that just evolves. I mean, I just keep listening to it, and stream of consciousness mixing, really. I don't have any specific technique that I use to do that, you know? It's just whatever hits me at the time. I kind of try to let the music guide me as to what I'm doing. That probably doesn't help much.